Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Horne, for joining me again.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I usually say you're listening to Black Agenda Radio. Now you're watching Black Agenda Radio. And I'm pleased to introduce our guest, Dr. Gerald Horne, a very prolific author and historian who currently holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And he's been a guest with us many times. The first time on our YouTube podcast as we discuss U.S. policy in Iran. Thank you again.
My pleasure.
So let's talk about the history of U.S. Policy versus Iran. I think it's a mistake to see hostilities as beginning on February 28th of this year. Also, this is seen as being Trump's actions as being doing what Israel wants. Now, it's undeniable that Israel wanted this, with Netanyahu practically taking up residence in Washington, visiting 7 times in a year. But this hostility towards Iran, these efforts to destabilize Iran, go back many years. Let's start at the beginning, from the start of the Iranian Revolution, and describing the ways in which the U.S. has carried out a variety of hostilities towards Iran.
Well, first of all, a footnote. In a few months, I'll be publishing a book that deals with the trade in enslaved Africans heading north and east, particularly to the Arab nations and into Persia as well. That is to say, the forerunner of Iran. But for the sake of time in our discussion here, let's begin in 1953 with the US and UK coup against the Mossadegh government, a left-leaning government, which poisoned the well with regard to US-Iranian relations, helping to make virtually unavoidable and inescapable the 1979 revolution, which was premised upon hostility to US imperialism. In fact, you can make an argument that part of the ideological mother's milk of Iran to this very day is hostility to US imperialism. That is to say that Washington, in the run-up and the prelude to the revolution, was seeking to make sure that the discredited, disgraced Shah, or so-called king, would return to the throne. And President Jimmy Carter took extraordinary measures to ensure that that would happen, which led inevitably to a backlash, including the so-called hostage crisis, where a number of U.S. nationals were held captive until January 1981, when President Ronald Wilson Reagan was inaugurated as president. I should also say that with regard to the tremendously bloody Iran-Iraq War, lasting approximately from 1980 to 1988, it was no secret that Washington was fully in support of Iraq as it sought to decapitate and destroy the Iranian regime. And since that time, there have been other, shall we say, hiccups in the relationship between Tehran and Washington, including, to fast forward to last year, the 12-day war, when in the midst of negotiations over the Iranian nuclear file, the United States began to bomb Iran. And then there's February 28th, which we're all familiar with. And I should also point out the blunders of the Trump regime up to and including an underestimation of the Iranian military and a misestimation of the correlation of forces, which has led Chancellor Merz in Germany to suggest the other day that the United States is being humiliated by Iran, that it has no strategy with regard to how to extricate itself from this morass that it has created. I should also mention a few issues concerning the domestic situation. As we all know, as I assume your audience knows, when Jim Crow began its agonizing and reluctant retreat 75 to 80 years ago, the bargain that was struck with the Black liberal leadership, what the late Glenn Ford used to call them his leadership class, was that in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions, there would be a turning away from global issues. And therefore, you saw the liberals stab Paul Robeson in the back and then toss him overboard, and not to mention countless number of comrades. Now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that deal basically expired, and it barely held water, even when it was supposedly in existence. But the liberals have helped to exemplify this notion, which we all know to be true, that if you don't use a muscle, it tends to atrophy. And since they have not been exercising any kind of intelligence or political acuity with regard to global affairs, they are missing in action with regard to this titanic and gargantuan crisis that U.S. imperialism is faced with, have no idea about how to take advantage of it. And even some of our Black nationalist friends have not been able to take the measure of U.S. imperialism with regard to the impact of this crisis on Africa. In the Wall Street Journal, just the other day, there was an article about how the United States is planning to improve relations with Eritrea, believe it or not, which there had been a virtual Cold War between these two countries for decades following independence 30-odd years ago. And this has everything to do with the Iranian conflict. That is to say, Israel moving into neighboring Somaliland, the breakaway province from Somalia, and therefore trying to challenge Turkey in the larger Somalia, Mogadishu, where Turkey plays a preeminent role. And therefore, U.S. and Israel will then challenge across the Red Sea, Ansar Allah, the so-called Houthis. Now, this will have maximum impact on Ethiopia because already we had known that Egypt was seeking to improve relations with Eritrea in order to put pressure on Addis Ababa. That inevitably will accelerate. And so it's understandable why there are those analysts who suggest that the United States is facing a crisis of Suez proportions. Recall what happened in 1956 with Britain, France, and once again Israel attacking Nasser's Egypt over control of the Suez Canal, and were forced into a hasty retreat, not only because of pressure from the Soviet Union, but from pressure from President Eisenhower as well. This led to the precipitous decline of the already tottering British Empire, probably contributing to the independence of Ghana in 1957, probably contributing to the successful conclusion of the Algerian War of Independence by 1962. And I dare say that this Iranian crisis will have similar significant ripples. You already see it with regard to the snit between London and Washington, the insults tossed across the Atlantic by President Trump and Prime Minister Keir Starmer, the fact that Prime Minister Sanchez in Spain has been denounced more than once by Mr. Trump. And of course, a reference here, the anti-Trump summit held in Barcelona just a few days ago, which was attended by President Ramaphosa of South Africa, Mia Mottley of Barbados, President Petro of Colombia, President Sheinbaum of Mexico, etc. In that context, I should mention that Mr. Trump has also expressed support for Argentina claiming the Malvinas or the Falklands, a British colony off the southern coast of South America, which Margaret Thatcher, you recall, fought a bloody war in the early 1980s to make sure it remained a British colony. This presents the kind of quandary that we in the United States face, because by all rights, the Malvinas should be part of Argentina, but whether it should come as a result of some sort of under-the-table deal between Mr. Milei in Buenos Aires and Mr. Trump in Washington against the colonial master in London, it's unclear where the equities lie. But once again, it's difficult to make an assessment if you're not even aware of the problem. And that's one of the problems that our community faces, is that many of our leaders and organizations are blissfully unaware of all of these changes, which means they are largely incapable of taking advantage of these changes, and most likely will become to be victimized by these changes.
You know, it's interesting about Iran and this latest U.S. effort to, well, actually, Trump said to enact regime change, but it's bigger. You've mentioned some of the connections, but there's always a connection to China in U.S. actions and Russia as well, I think to a lesser extent. But talk to us about what the Trump administration was trying to achieve in Iran vis-a-vis China.
Well, obviously, you have to connect it to the events in Caracas of January 3rd, 2026. That is to say, the abduction, kidnapping of President Maduro and Celia Flores, first combatant, and dragging them into a dank prison cell in New York City. Caracas, Venezuela, had been a major supplier of petroleum to the People's Republic of China. And if you look at the so-called national security strategy of late 2025, enunciated by the Trump regime, it left many analysts baffled and befuddled because it did not concentrate heavily on the major antagonists, which would be China, and then, as you suggested, Russia. It concentrated instead on the hemisphere and the so-called Monroe Doctrine, a play on the Monroe Doctrine, that is to say the United States should be in complete charge of what's going on in this hemisphere. And therefore, we have to reference the continuing pressure on socialist Cuba as we speak. But now, what has happened with regard to this Iranian escapade is that we can see what the larger outlines of the strategy are. That is to say, the idea of the Trump regime was to overthrow the Islamic Republic within 3 or 4 or 5 days of February 28th, and then it would have not only control of Venezuela petroleum going to China, but Iranian petroleum going to China. Already in the New York Times today, there is an article about some of the negative knock-on effects of this present global crisis is having on the Chinese economy. Now, of course, China has a storehouse of energy that it has stashed away, but like most countries, including the United States of America, I'm afraid to say, it will be negatively impacted by this attempted regime change in Iran. This makes all the more important and crucial this upcoming summit between President Trump and President Xi Jinping in Beijing within a few weeks. Inevitably, Mr. Trump will go with his begging bowl, virtually imploring Beijing to continue to buy U.S. Treasury bills so the U.S. government can stay afloat, and so that Washington will have sufficient resources to pursue regime change in China, believe it or not. But I dare say that Mr. Trump may be in for a rude shock and surprise. Now, with regard to Russia, pay attention to the recent trip of the foreign minister of Iran to Moscow, actually to St. Petersburg, to meet with President Putin, because the outlines of a nuclear deal are coming into focus. Recall that Mr. Obama had organized the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which Mr. Trump called one of the worst deals ever, and he tore it up and decided that bombing was the better part of wisdom. But now we're moving to sort of a JCPOA light, but this one will involve Russia. That is to say that the enriched uranium, or what Mr. Trump sometimes refers to as the nuclear dust, will presumably be taken to Russia, where it is under strict supervision. Since Russia is a de facto ally of Iran, the Iranian authorities would not necessarily be opposed to this. Mr. Trump if he had wisdom, which obviously he's sorely lacking, he could claim that this was a concession. But given some of the rather hysterical editorials from the right wing, not only in the Wall Street Journal, where John Bolton said that the only solution is regime change in Iran, or in the Washington Post just a few days ago, where Mark Thiessen, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, suggested something similar. And so, given the fact that Mr. Trump has betrayed that part of the base of MAGA, which thought that he was against forever wars and thought that he was against foreign intervention, it's apparent that they were snookered, perhaps willingly, willfully. But in any case, the end of this war, I'm afraid to say, is hardly in sight. And this means more stress on U.S. consumers. I understand in Southern California, the price of a gallon of gasoline is heading towards $7. It'll probably be heading towards 10 by the end of the year. Given the fact that we have just been told that the United Arab Emirates is withdrawing from OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, this will induce even further stress on the global price of a barrel of oil. And if the United States has a cold with regard to this economic stress, many countries in Africa will be fighting pneumonia as a result of this stress. And once again, to reiterate, it really calls for a renewed and re-energized program by many of our Black leaders and organizations to intervene with regard to this crisis, because one of the lessons of history that I hope we have imbibed is that there is an inevitable connection between the fate of Africa and the Caribbean on the one hand and the fate of Black Americans on the other. That is to say, the deal that was cut with the U.S. ruling class, as I noted, has gone well past its expiration date. And if Africa and the Caribbean are suffering, certainly our community will be suffering as well.
I wanted to ask you about the many tensions here. So we know that Trump himself wanted regime change. Israel wants regime change. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, apparently wants regime change. He made a statement about just finish the job. I'm paraphrasing, something like that. What is that about?
Well, it depends on, once again, where you want to begin the chronology. If I had more time, I would begin the chronology with regard to the wars against Native Americans that accelerated in the 19th century. That is to say, that helped to inaugurate this crusade, this campaign for regime change against policies that were not deemed to be, quote, white, unquote. It's a part of white supremacy. It's a part of settler colonialism, etc. Inevitably, settler colonialism bled into a reinvigorated U.S. imperialism at the end of the 19th century with the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy and its incorporation into the United States by 1959. And I think that the U.S. authorities feel that at the end of the day, they can profit more handsomely if they engage in regime change and actually put their puppets in power, as opposed to dealing with patriotic regimes. And I think that that's what's animating that Wall Street Journal op-ed by John Bolton, referenced a moment or two ago. That's what's animating the reported remarks of Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase. And that kind of maniacal obsession will not be overturned unless and until we are able to organize sufficiently in order to make sure that it does not occur.
And speaking of Black politics, or rather the lack of Black politics, and obviously I don't mean Black politicians, but the politics that, as you pointed out, were once enunciated by the masses of Black people, I think still to this day, perhaps to a lesser extent, we see the criticism of Trump from so-called Black political leadership. The criticism comes from the right that Trump is not executing this war well enough, that basically the war isn't going the way he wanted. That is what Hakeem Jeffries and other Black elected officials are saying, which I don't think is in line with the way most Black people see these things. I think still most Black people are opposed to U.S. aggression around the world. And yet these people, these so-called representatives, in a variety of ways, don't represent us. And so we see this so-called opposition party, meaning the Democrats, not really opposing what Trump did, attacking him from the right, going through these phony votes, war powers authorizations that always lose by like 1 or 2 votes. How convenient is that? So talk to us about Black people and the Democratic Party in regard to this issue.
Well, what should be keeping radicals and progressives up at night is the fact that the Trump Republican Party and the MAGA movement will suffer significant losses in November. Now, obviously, that's good news, but the bad news is that given the present balance of forces, may lead to a rise, once again, of the Democratic Party, which will once again begin to try to execute its harebrained scheme of confronting Russia and China simultaneously. There lies disaster. The only good news there is that in order to pursue this ill-advised policy, they don't have to have the Europeans on board. And I'm not sure if the European Union and or Britain will be up for that particular task. Now, certainly the EU and Britain will be up for the task of confronting Russia. And in fact, once again, what should be keeping us up at night is the fact that Germany is rearming. We've seen this movie before. Automobile plants are being encouraged to convert to arms manufacturers. This presents very unpleasant echoes of Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941, when Berlin invaded the Soviet Union, leaving death and destruction in its wake. Seemingly, that lesson of history has been forgotten. And I'm afraid to say that if the Democrats come into power once again, that they will not necessarily be opposed to Germany rearming, for example. Now, part of the complication of U.S. relations with the European Union is that President Macron has become ever more hawkish with regard to Washington. I'll never forget when I was living in British Columbia last year, when Mr. Trump first started talking about making Canada the 51st state. French submarines were sent off the coast of Nova Scotia within hailing distance of New England and Boston, for example. You recall what happened when Charles de Gaulle, the leader of France in the 1960s, came to Quebec and encouraged separatism in that important Canadian province. And so Washington, I think, has misestimated its strength and power, which you think that they would have learned from this debacle in Iran. But alas, apparently that is not the case. And certainly, I think that the Democrats are not in a position to take us on a path towards peace and prosperity, which the masses of people demand and clamor for. And that will ever be the case, once again, as long as many of our leaders and organizations cling to the expired pact, which suggests that concessions will flow as long as we go along with U.S. imperialist adventures abroad. That deal, which was bankrupt from its inception, is now leading us over the cliff.
Yes, it certainly is. And, one of my concerns, and that of many people, these so-called ceasefires with Iran are meant for the U.S. to try to recalibrate and perhaps rearm or strategize on how to attack Iran. But it seems clear to me that the U.S. cannot overthrow this government without direct military force, without sending boots on the ground, as the saying goes, which I think would be a disaster. Politically, it would be a disaster. So they're kind of, they're hamstrung, are they not? I don't think they can do what they originally intended to do. So I have a fear that this is just going to go on in this strange state where we have, as you pointed out, these economic ripple effects around the world. What are your thoughts about the long term? What are your predictions long term about this crisis?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, on the one hand, there's a justifiable allergy, not only in the U.S. ruling class, but I would say even more so in the part of the U.S. working class and middle class with regard to U.S. soldiers coming back to Dover, Delaware in body bags to be buried, for example. I think that is a restraining factor with regard to so-called boots on the ground. But at the same time, we recognize that there are thousands of U.S. sailors and soldiers in the region as we speak, even though NBC has reported that there were billions of dollars in damage inflicted on U.S. bases and other surrounding areas as a result of this conflict, despite the fact that Israel is still spoiling for a fight, as evidenced by its continuing bombardment of southern Lebanon, for example, where you also see casualties inflicted upon the so-called Israeli Defense Forces. And the fact that Israel has suggested, we understand, that any removal of U.S. bases from Kuwait or Qatar or de facto bases in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, can be replicated in Israel itself. And given the strength of the Israeli lobby on this side of the Atlantic, and given the strength of the Israeli lobby within the highest councils of the Trump administration, you need only look at his negotiators, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to see that particular thesis exemplified. This does not necessarily bode well for a peaceful resolution of this crisis. And I'm reluctant to make the point that ultimately U.S. imperialism will have to suffer a staggering, overwhelming defeat on the battlefield in order for it to retreat ignominiously. I would like to think that that's not the case, but as I look at the balance of forces and the correlation of forces, it tips me in the direction of that particular prognostication.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Horne. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you again. Have a good day.